She gave me her Nobel Prize, but I'll tell you what, I got to know her. I never met her before, and I was very, very impressed. She's this is a fine woman.
Imagine what this will mean to have these dictatorships finally gone.
This is Today As It Happened. Good Friday evening to you. I'm Stephanie Liebergen, guiding you through our timeline of the day's most important news, from President Donald Trump's health care proposal to a court appearance by the man accused of killing Charlie Kirk. But first, let's take a look at some of our other top headlines of the day. The Pentagon is moving a carrier strike group to the Middle East as tensions rise over protests in Iran. A source says the USS Abraham Lincoln, which is currently in the South China Sea, is heading to the region. The carrier can hold dozens of planes and helicopters, including F-35 fighter jets, but it could take up to a week to reach the Persian Gulf. The move comes as President Trump is promising to help Iranian protesters without giving any specifics as to how or when. Protests continued in Minneapolis last night as demonstrators heckled and shouted at ICE officers. Officials on scene used tear gas and warned those gathered to stay off federal property or risk being arrested. Last night's protest followed President Trump's threat to use the Insurrection Act to deploy troops and try to quell the ongoing protests. A bipartisan group of lawmakers are in Copenhagen today, meeting with officials from Denmark and Greenland to discuss President Trump's interest in acquiring the island nation. Nearly a dozen lawmakers made the trip, including Senators Chris Coons and Lisa Murkowski. The meeting comes after Greenland and Denmark sent their own delegations to the U.S. earlier this week. Scripps News congressional correspondent Nathaniel Reed joining me now live from our D.C. newsroom. So the lawmakers met with their counterparts in Copenhagen. What did they say their message was?
Yeah, and this came just a couple days, Stephanie, after the foreign minister of Denmark, a former prime minister, Lars Løkke Rasmussen, came out of a meeting with Vice President J.D. Vance and other administration officials, saying that there was a quote-unquote fundamental disagreement between both the Danish delegation and the Trump administration about the idea that Denmark is simply not for sale, something that the Danes have repeatedly stressed over and over again. Now, that bipartisan group of lawmakers just met with the states minister. It's the Danish equivalent to a prime minister at Christiansborg, which is the location of Danish parliament in Copenhagen. During that meeting, they said it was a chance to underscore that not all members of the U.S. government, specifically the Democratic and Republican members of the Senate and representatives who went on that congressional delegation, do not believe that taking over Greenland, the territory of a prime U.S. ally, a close U.S. ally, and a fellow member of NATO, is a wise decision, something that they deeply disagree with the Trump administration on. And that message, not just coming from Democrats, but also the Republicans that went as well. Take a listen.
When you ask the American people whether or not they think it is a good idea for the United States to acquire Greenland, the vast majority, some 75%, will say, we do not think that that is a good idea. This senator from Alaska does not think it is a good idea. And I want to build on the relationship that we have had. As Aya and I penned in an op-ed about a year ago, Greenland needs to be viewed as our ally, not as an asset. And I think that's what you're hearing with this delegation.
You just heard there Senator Lisa Murkowski, Republican from Alaska, who obviously has broken with President Trump number of key issues, but, making quite clear there that it's not the right move for the president to continue this rhetoric. I asked Senator Chris Coons, who was on that congressional delegation just yesterday here in Washington, if he's concerned about the rhetoric from the president of the United States and whether the president's rhetoric could destroy NATO. The answer to that, he said, was yes. At the same time, these lawmakers trying to go to reassure our Danish counterparts, other members of NATO who came to our defense after the U.S. invoked Article 5 in the days after the 2001 September 11th terrorist attacks in Lower Manhattan, trying to reassure the Danes that this would not be a path forward. Again, President Trump continues to refuse to rule out military force as part of his desire to purchase Greenland. Repeatedly, both the Greenlandish and Danish governments have said, again and again, Greenland is not for sale.
I think Senator Murkowski put it very clearly and concisely. Greenland is an ally, not an asset. So we'll have to see what the Trump administration tries to do from here. But Nate, I also want to dig in on healthcare a little bit, which has been a big topic in recent months. The president, after years of promises, finally unveiled what he's calling his new healthcare plan. What can you tell us about that?
Well, pretty simple name, the Great Healthcare Plan. The problem is there's still a lot of questions about what's exactly in the plan. The president laying out this framework yesterday to try and codify some of his most favored nation's pricing executive orders, something pharma companies appear to be opposed to, at least have told the Scripps News Group in statements they're opposed to. He also wants to send Americans dollars directly to health savings accounts that they could then use to pay down the cost of their health insurance. The reality is these conversations from the president and these proposals from the president are ongoing while there are simultaneous negotiations that have been underway on Capitol Hill with Democrats and Republicans to try and find a way to bring back those Affordable Care Act tax credits, which expired at the end of last year. Worth noting, the president's plan would not accomplish that, but this bipartisan group of lawmakers has been trying to find a way to lower the cost of health care. They recently, however, according to the lead Republican negotiator, hit a pretty major snag. Take a listen. Healthcare negotiations, are they stalled?
Enhanced premium tax credits. Here's where we're at. So we are in a little bit of a pothole. Democrats that we're talking to are absolutely there in good faith. They absolutely want to get a deal done. They are absolutely willing to do an extension of reforms. But what I've seen in my year here is that unless the Democrat leader wants a deal to happen, it just will not happen.
Pretty pointed criticism there of Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer. Again, this is looking like increasingly it's going to be a big issue in the 2026 midterm elections just later this year. Democrats frequently have tried to run on the Affordable Care Act, to run as the party that backs health care. Republicans, have struggled over the last decade to try and coalesce around a health care plan that would work to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. The president's health care plan, still an open question about whether enough lawmakers would support it to allow it to become law. Worth noting that the White House saying yesterday they want a bipartisan group of lawmakers to approve this. Really hard to see how that's possible if there's no extension in there of those Affordable Care Act tax credits or not a lot of meaningful negotiations on Capitol Hill about what that health care plan could look like. So might be too soon to say for the president's health care plan, but certainly a long-awaited plan finally coming out of the White House.
Having a plan, certainly step one, but getting some kind of presumably bipartisan agreement on Capitol Hill, that is a very different step and likely one that is pretty far away from us right now. Scripps News congressional correspondent Nathaniel Reed, as always, thank you very much. Coming up on Today As It Happened.
Newly released records give a new perspective on what happened to the woman who was shot to death in Minneapolis by an ICE officer. I'm Lori Jangliha. Ahead, a look at the 911 transcripts and some incident reports.
Welcome back to Today As It Happened. Let's return to our briefing of today's top stories.
Hey! Stop kneeing him in the face! That's his face!
That is cell phone video capturing a group of Border Patrol agents kneeing a man in the face at least 5 times while he's pinned to the ground. The woman who recorded this video, well, she's a nurse, and she says she encountered this on her way to work. Now, this incident is happening as the ACLU is filing a lawsuit on behalf of 3 men, one of them a 20-year-old U.S. citizen who alleges he was pepper sprayed last week for recording federal agents as they drove past him. He says he was violently detained by federal agents during his lunch break and claims they refused to look at his passport. A Homeland Security spokesman called the ACLU's allegations disgusting, reckless, and categorically false. And all new this morning, the Scripps News investigative team obtained new records from Minneapolis, giving graphic new details on that ICE shooting that left a mother of 3 dead. Scripps News senior investigative correspondent Lori Jane Bliha is live with us now with a bit more on what exactly is in those documents. Lori Jane?
Hey, Stephanie, they released 911 transcripts, a report from the police department, and dispatch and incident reports from rescue crews who were called to the scene.
No!
New documents released by the City of Minneapolis reveal what emergency crews found when they arrived to the scene of a deadly shooting. A woman in a vehicle shot by an ICE officer. Records show the woman, Renee Good, was unresponsive with an inconsistent, thready pulse. First responders reported finding gunshot wounds to the patient's right chest, left forearm, and a possible gunshot wound on the left side of her head. Crews said they tried to save Good by using a tourniquet and chest compressions and requesting an ambulance. Medics eventually took her to the hospital but couldn't save her life. The City of Minneapolis also released transcripts of 911 calls, not the actual audio. They show a number of distraught witnesses calling in to report the shooting. One saying a bunch of ICE agents just shot a lady, point-blank range in her car. They shot her because she wouldn't open her car door. There's video of it, too. The person uses expletives to describe the situation. In another 911 report, a call taker tells the caller to catch their breath after they reported they witnessed the shooting. The person says ICE fired shots into her windshield, saying that officers made the caller step back from the scene. The person says they saw an ICE officer fire 2 shots and that the woman tried to drive away but crashed. And Stephanie, there were several other calls included in this transcript, including one from someone who said they were calling after receiving information from the Joint Operation Command Center, which is a law enforcement post. That caller reported what they described were agitators and told a dispatcher that, quote, our locals had fired shots. And again, as we've been reporting, the person who fired the shots that day was that ICE officer. Stephanie.
Well, Laura Jane, how did we get all of these records from the City of Minneapolis?
Well, Stephanie, as we always do, whenever there's a major incident, we request public records to try to understand more about what happened directly from the source. So we submitted requests for local 911, police and fire records on the day of the incident last week, and they were just released to us yesterday.
Well, there's been a dispute between state and federal officials about who exactly is investigating this shooting. Do these new records shed any light on those investigations?
There is some information in the record, Stephanie. They indicate that Minneapolis police responded to the scene to help with crowd control and to establish a perimeter around the scene. One record indicated police had been in touch with a, quote, ICE admin within an hour of the shooting who said they were sending an evidence gathering team and would handle the OIS, which, Stephanie, as we know, is officer-involved shooting. Stephanie.
Scripps News senior national investigative correspondent Lori Jane Gliha, live for us. Thank you very much. Unrest in Minneapolis continues as tense protests are reaching a boiling point in the wake of last week's deadly shooting involving an ICE agent. I want to get right out to Scripps News Group's correspondent Jenna Ray, live on the ground in Minneapolis. Jenna, what is happening behind you?
Stephanie, we're standing outside of the Bishop Henry Whipple Federal Building. It's been kind of the epicenter of ICE's enforcement operations here in the Twin Cities. I'm going to pan so you can kind of see what's going on. In just the last several minutes, we have seen several federal law enforcement agents out here. They are seemingly in full riot gear, as we call it. They've got helmets on, masks on, gas masks on. Some of them have guns that look to be just rubber bullets on them. They came out just a few minutes before we went on the air, and it looked like there were some protesters. I'm going to pan off just to the left of it. You can see where that truck's going in right there. That's where protesters were kind of standing earlier. They were on the other side of this public street. They were talking only with federal agents at the time, and it's federal agents were asking them to get onto the sidewalk so that they weren't blocking the street. It did not seem like those protesters were listening. So that resulted in a few agents tackling one of those protesters to the ground, taking them into custody, into this federal building behind me. And then, of course, now we see that these federal agents are out here in full force right now. They have gotten protesters, for the most part, out of the street. But this is what we've been seeing for the last 24 hours, 48 hours. It's kind of this trend that we see, where the protesters have been here. We know that they have been here several days, and they've been primarily on this sidewalk that we're standing on here, side of the street. Every hour, every couple of hours, we're seeing these federal agents coming out dressed in this riot gear, which seemingly looks like confronting these protesters. A lot of the times the protesters are on the sidewalk and they're demands of the federal law enforcement, but as I mentioned, we have seen some of these protesters go across the street and onto that federal building property. which is what it seems like these ICE agents and federal agents are trying to stop. Again, right now, I'm gonna let you watch this right now, Stephanie.
Yeah, Jenna, it sounds certainly loud, and I want to keep with the video right now as all of those officers are moving backward in a line, visually moving away from the protesters, so we can only hope that that would maybe help decrease any potential tension. Jenna, what are they saying?
The protesters on this side of the street are asking ICE to get out of Minneapolis and out of the state of Minnesota. That is the theme that we have seen for several weeks now. It's the main message from people who have been protesting the ICE federal enforcement operations here on the ground. But again, this is this cat and mouse game that we've seen time and time again of protesters who have been on the sidewalk peacefully for the most part protesting, and then these ICE agents coming out full force, this riot gear, kind of instigating with protesters, which has escalated things than they were previously when the agents were not here on the ground.
Scripps News Group correspondent Jenna Ray, thank you so much for being out there for us in the cold weather of Minneapolis, and please do stay safe. We'll be back in just a moment as we continue tracking today's top news. Welcome back to Today As It Happened. I'm Stephanie Liebergen. Let's continue our walkthrough of the day's top headlines.
Just about 1 month. That's how long we've been waiting now for the full release of the Epstein files. Keep in mind that law that was passed by Congress mandated the Justice Department release them all or explain why it is not. So how many documents have actually been released? Less than 1%. Frustrating for victims and also for members of Congress. Scripps News national correspondent Alex Miller is live in New York now. And Alex, the judge says they want answers. The government just responded. What did they say?
Well, let's back up just a little bit and talk about how we got here, because members of Congress, Congressman Ro Khanna and Thomas Massie, those are the authors of the bill that forced the Department of Justice to release all of this information. They are not happy, as you mentioned, with how slow all of this is going. So they wrote to the judge in Maxwell's case saying that he needed to appoint someone to oversee the Department of Justice, an inspector general of sorts, to make sure that the DOJ not only is complying, but they actually want to compel testimony about the production status, because they say it's just not moving fast enough. They want to know if improper redactions are taking place, improper conduct is taking place. I want to read you a little bit of what they wrote in this letter initially. They say, put simply, the Department of Justice cannot be trusted with making mandatory disclosures under the Act while we believe that criminal violations have taken place. That's notable. They believe that there's criminal issue with the way this has happened. They say it must be addressed, but they're focused right now on the need for the DOJ to produce all documents related to this act. So they do not have the confidence, Del, that the DOJ is going to do its job on its own. And the DOJ, as you mentioned, responded just a couple of hours ago saying, essentially, this is a lot of work. They say the compliance is a substantial undertaking and that they're working with victims themselves, but also with their counsel to make sure that they are doing the proper redactions, which victims have some things to say about that. But Attorney General Pam Bondi says that there are 500 reviewers right now. 80 additional attorneys were added just this week to try to get this process moving a little bit faster. And she says they've made substantial progress, Del, but really notable again, there is no deadline as to when they are going to have this information released for the public. They are not setting a deadline for themselves to try to make this happen, at least not at this juncture.
Some survivors are expressing their own frustrations with the redaction process. What are they saying?
Well, look, there are some 1,000 survivors that we believe to be out there, but there are a group of them who we have seen on the steps of Capitol Hill who have been really the most vocal. They wrote a letter to the Department of Justice Inspector General expressing frustration on really two accounts. This first one is that they believe that actually some of the redactions, remember, we saw full pages redact, that they're frustrated that some private information has been disclosed. If you can see up here, it says these failures have caused have caused renewed harm to survivors and undermined trust in the institutions responsible for safeguarding sensitive information. So even though we've seen blacked out pages over and over again, they're saying some private information still made its way through. But they also, this second part is what's really interesting. They say the selective nature of redactions also raises concerns about whether decisions were influenced by factors unrelated to survivor protection. Even the appearance that redactions were applied to protect certain individuals rather than survivors erodes public trust and reinforces longstanding concerns about unequal accountability in cases. They're concerned right now that the focus is not really on making sure their names are redacted, their personal information is redacted, but instead making sure that other people's names, particularly perpetrators' names, have been redacted here. They say that it is reopening old wounds and that there is harm compounded from this situation. They say that reputational considerations are being taken into account over basic ethical obligations. Again, we have not seen a single name of any perpetrators thus far.
Alex, before I let you go, does this now call into question the veracity of the Attorney General's claims early on, last summer, in fact, that she had reviewed all of the files and there was nothing to see here?
Absolutely. And it actually even calls into question the fact that they say in one of the letters, they essentially said, you know, we've put forward the most important information. Well, how do they know that if they haven't gone through every single piece of information? It is believed that there's some 2 million documents to go through, and some people believe that it's even more than that. So there are still a lot of questions about whether all these documents have even really been reviewed by the current administration's Department of Justice.
Straight ahead on Today As It Happened.
Why would you want someone else's Nobel Prize?
Well, she offered it to me.
Welcome back to Today As It Happened, Scripps News end-of-day snapshot of our biggest stories. So let's pick up right where we left off.
We continue to follow breaking news. Another planned pardon by President Trump. The president plans to pardon the former governor of Puerto Rico, Wanda Vasquez. She pleaded guilty last August to a campaign finance violation. The case also involved a former FBI agent and a Venezuelan banker. Trump says Vasquez's investigation began days after she endorsed him in 2020. He called the case political prosecution. President Trump says he may punish countries with tariffs if they don't support U.S. control of Greenland. He didn't provide any details. He has repeatedly said, though, the United States needs Greenland for national security. Before now, the president hasn't mentioned using tariffs to force the issue. Greenland is a self-governing territory that is part of the Kingdom of Denmark. European leaders have joined Denmark in saying the U.S. can't control the world's largest island. The White House today hosting a roundtable touting investments in rural health care. President Trump was joined by a number of administration officials and a few members of Congress. Now, this roundtable coming a day after the Trump administration's new so-called Great Health Care Plan, an effort aimed at lowering health care costs for Americans. Scripps News White House correspondent Haley Bull joins us live now. And Haley, you were in the room for today's roundtable. The president's plan has been criticized for being light on specifics. Did we learn any new details?
Not new details, but the president touting his proposed health care plan as the White House urges Congress to act on it. CMS Administrator Dr. Mehmet Oz describing it as a framework and calling on Congress to help craft it. The plan aims to send money directly to Americans to buy their own insurance, fund a cost-sharing reduction program, increase price transparency, and codify most favored nation pricing, though a number of questions on the details remain, Dell. The roundtable also celebrating the Rural Health Transformation Program, in which states have received grants for this effort. But bigger picture here, Dell, the healthcare plan comes as a number of Americans are facing increased premiums after Congress last year failed to reach an agreement on the extension of Affordable Care Act subsidies. And as we have seen, the White House more focused on the issue of affordability. The president today saying he thinks they can make health care a Republican issue. Now, it comes as the administration has indicated that officials and the president are expected to share their message on the road more. As polling has shown, many Americans remain concerned over pricing, Dow.
So, Haley, the president, I understand, also talked a little bit about his meeting yesterday with Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Machado. We know he got the Nobel Peace Prize from her. Did that change the way he sees her ability to run the country?
Well, Del, the president praised Maria Corina Machado following that meeting today, but stopped short of public backing of her specific leadership. The president today, as he left the White House within the last hour, calling her a wonderful woman and praising the gesture from the Venezuelan opposition leader of giving him her Nobel Peace Prize. The president saying he was impressed and that the two would talk again. And that is an apparent shift in tone after we initially heard the president suggest that she did not have the respect to lead Venezuela after the ouster of Nicolas Maduro. Now, the Trump administration so far has worked with Maduro's number 2 in command, Delcy Rodriguez, who is now serving as the interim president of Venezuela. The president here, President Trump, pushed on the administration's alignment with Rodriguez versus Machado, and he explained it like this.
If you ever remember a place called Iraq where everybody was fired, every single person, the police, the generals, everybody was fired, and they ended up being ISIS. Instead of just getting down to business, they ended up being ISIS. So I remember that. But I'll tell you, I had a great meeting yesterday by a person who I have a lot of respect for, and she has respect, obviously, for me and our country. And she gave me her Nobel Prize. But I'll tell you what, I got to know her. I never met her before, and I was very, very impressed. She's this is a fine woman.
So, Del, how this changes the calculus, if it changes the calculus at all long-term, remains to be seen. We are also learning that CIA Director John Ratcliffe met with Delcy Rodriguez yesterday, as well as the president was meeting yesterday with Maria Corina Machado at the direction of President Trump, according to a U.S. official. That meeting, we understand, lasted about 2 hours, in which Ratcliffe talked about opportunities for economic collaboration, stressed the need for Venezuela to stop supporting narco traffickers, and asked for collaboration in taking down drug organizations. An official telling us that it laid the groundwork for continued collaboration, Del.
Scripps News White House correspondent Haley Bowforce live on the North Lawn. Haley, thank you very much. A grand jury has just indicted a man in connection with the double murder of his ex-wife and her husband. Happened in Columbus last month. That is Michael David McKee, facing murder and weapons charges now. He's a 39-year-old vascular surgeon from Chicago. McKee is accused of killing Monique Tepe and her husband, Spencer, back on December 30th. The couple's 2 young children and the dog weren't harmed. Tens of thousands of Cubans gathering in Havana today. They're upset over the killing of those 32 Cuban officers in Venezuela. Demonstration happening right across from the U.S. Embassy. The crowd demanding the release of former Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. Maduro was arrested by the United States on January 3rd. Cuba's foreign ministry describing the protest as a response to threats against peace and sovereignty. Cuba's president was there. A shakeup at the Pentagon's oldest newspaper. Applicants are now being asked what they would do to advance President Trump's agenda. Washington Post reporting that is what applicants for Stars and Stripes are being asked. The Pentagon says it is changing the newspaper to get rid of what it calls woke distractions. That paper has been around for decades. Congress established the paper's independence back in the 90s. Critics warn the Stars and Stripes is becoming a mouthpiece of the administration. The man accused of shooting and killing conservative activist Charlie Kirk is back in court today. Tyler Robinson's attorneys asking the judge to disqualify the prosecutors alleging a conflict of interest. They say one of the children of a deputy county attorney was at the event Kirk was hosting at Utah Valley University. That is when Kirk was shot and killed in front of the public. Prosecutors asking the judge to deny the disqualification. Robinson is charged with aggravated murder.
Coming up on Today As It Happened.
Why the urgent need all of a sudden to take over the island?
You know what? I think the president has an eye on his legacy.
Thanks again for joining us on Today As It Happened. I'm Stephanie Liebergen with your daily look at the day's biggest stories.
President Trump saying today that he may punish countries with tariffs if they don't support U.S. control of Greenland. didn't provide any details, but he has repeatedly said the United States needs Greenland for national security. Our next guest is an expert on the geopolitics of the Arctic. Dr. Becca Pincus is a senior fellow at both the Foreign Policy Research Institute and the German Marshall Fund. Dr. Pincus, thanks for being with us today. In the easiest terms for our audience, why is Greenland such a strategic need in global politics?
Greenland is important to the United States for several reasons. And the biggest reason, the longest, most historic reason is that it's been part of our homeland defense and our early warning missile defense shield for a long time, since the early days of the Cold War. So the U.S. military has had a base in northwest Greenland, Thule Air Base for a long time. It was recently renamed Batufik Space Base, handed over from the Air Force to the Space Force a few years ago. And that base hosts an early warning radar that points north over the Arctic Ocean and protects the U.S. homeland and North America against incoming ICBMs. So that's sort of the top reason. I will also note that economic arguments are made very frequently. Greenland does have a significant deposit of strategic minerals, which we know are very important today. So that's a part of it, the economic argument. So I think it's probably those two pieces that get talked about most of all.
I want you to listen to what the White House press secretary had to say on this very issue just yesterday. Take a listen.
The president has made his priority quite clear. He wants the United States to acquire Greenland. He thinks it's in our best national security to do that.
You testified in front of Congress last year about Greenland and the Arctic. You pointed out that the 1951 Defense Agreement gives the United States Greenland, access to Greenland, and that we've never been denied. We had 17 bases at one time, now we have one. Why the need all of a sudden to take over the island?
I think the president has an eye on his legacy. It's his second term, and if you look at his language on Greenland, he has talked about the psychological importance of this. He's talked about, I think the real estate terms of this, and so I do think that while a lot of observers are pointing to the defense agreement, and we hope that can be leveraged to get us to a diplomatic solution, I think in some ways this is it's more personal for the president, and I think that does make the diplomacy more complicated.
So are we talking about a presidential vanity project? We hear in history about the Louisiana Purchase and adding Alaska and Hawaii to the flag. Is that what he wants? Does he want to be able to say Trump, Greenland, I suppose?
I think this is he has an eye on building a legacy, and it would be a tremendous line in the history books if the U.S. acquired Greenland. I think it is unrealistic. And I think the realities of this are going to be crashing in on the administration. But I do think that if you look at the language that's being expressed by the president and those in his inner circle, there is a piece of this where, it's a grandiose proposal. And also, if you put next to it the fact that we haven't really seen kind of a clear and specific articulation of need. They've talked about national security, they've talked about economics, but when you unpack those arguments, they don't, they're not persuasive. And so I do think some of this is the sort of symbolic value that it carries.
Dr. Becca Pincus. Dr. Pincus, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Straight ahead on Today As It Happened.
Frustrations are high there. People are scared. People are sad to see what's going on, and yet people also want to stand up for their communities.
President Trump has threatened to use the Insurrection Act to send U.S. troops into Minnesota to, quote, put an end to the protests. There are currently 3,000 federal agents in Minnesota amid Operation Metro Surge, which officials with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security say has yielded 2,500 arrests since it began last month. Maritza Giorgio is here now for our Week in Politics discussion, and of course, Minnesota has been a top headline all week long. The Trump administration is showing no signs of backing down from their immigration enforcement there. So How do you think we turn down the temperature in places like Minnesota?
Boy, Stephanie, that is the really big question right now. You know, I grew up in Minneapolis. I know these neighborhoods very well, and it's alarming to see what is happening there. Again, this is after such a hard, let's say, 6 years now for Minnesota. The George Floyd killing was, you know, a horrific time period for the state of Minnesota. We had the political assassinations earlier last year, I guess now it is, in 2025. We had the school shooting. It's been a really, really rough go for the people of Minnesota and specifically Minneapolis. I know that frustrations are high there. People are scared. People are sad to see what's going on, and yet people also want to stand up for their community. So I don't know the answer to bringing down the temperature. I'm worried about some demonstrations planned there this weekend, about some clashes, and you know, with the president floating the idea of going with the Insurrection Act and sending more troops in, you know, right now they have, it's estimated 3,000 total ICE agents that will be on the ground in Minnesota by weekend's end. That's 5 times the manpower of the Minneapolis Police Department. So I'm not sure more actual troops would do anything to bring down the temperature.
All right, that is something we heard. We were listening a little bit earlier this morning to the House Democratic field hearing where we were hearing mayors from St. Paul, from Minneapolis, saying that it's the troops on the ground, it's the surging of these DHS officials that is causing the problem and the conflict. But Maritza, we have got to talk about Greenland. President Trump has insisted now, we've heard him say repeatedly, that the U.S. needs to take over Greenland, that the U.S. needs to buy Greenland. But Iceland's leaders, Denmark's leaders, clearly not interested, have repeatedly said Greenland is not for sale. So why is the president so fixated on this northern island?
Yeah, we've heard so many different ideas coming from the president about tactics to use regarding taking over Greenland. Now, he says it's about security, it's about defense strategy. Also keep in mind there are mineral resources to think about here. But the thing is, this is not a new idea for the president, Stephanie. We had on our show former national security official Miles Taylor last week, and he remembers the first time he heard this idea floated, and it was in 2017 when it was just kind of brushed off as a joke, as something that wasn't serious. Now, Miles Taylor told us, and he's been very vocal about this, that this is causing a lot of alarm within the NATO alliance, right? Because either NATO steps up, if there's some kind of invasion of Greenland from the United States, NATO could step up and basically we would be in conflict with them, or they could admit that Article 5 is basically useless. And Miles Taylor has said that either outcome would be catastrophic. So a lot of concern here. And the people of Greenland have not signaled any kind of favor of being taken over or being United States citizens. Even as the White House even reportedly floated the idea, this was according to a Reuters report, of sending people in Greenland each individual checks anywhere from $10,000 to $100,000. And my question to that is, what would American citizens say if all of a sudden people across the ocean are getting $100,000 checks and we're struggling to pay for our bills?
That certainly could potentially be a look that would not likely be a very good one for the Trump administration. There is a bipartisan delegation that's in Denmark right now talking about this, attempted Greenland takeover. What can Congress do to stop the president if he continues down this path of trying to take over Greenland?
Well, we've certainly already seen pushback from Republicans on this. There was a fiery floor speech on the Senate floor from Senator Thom Tillis last week when he really railed against this and really railed against Stephen Miller, President Trump's advisor on this, saying that it was basically a stupid idea. And, we've also seen that Representative Don Bacon has signaled, he made headlines just a few days ago signaling that there would be support for impeachment if the U.S. tried to invade Greenland. We should also mention that Representative Bacon joined a bipartisan and bicameral effort yesterday, basically introducing this bill. And the bill text says that it would affirm the United States partnership with Greenland and Denmark, basically recognizing that any path forward should be treated peacefully and to comply with any treaty obligations that we have. So I think that there are talks happening in Congress, both with Democrats and Republicans, about how to respond to this. But interestingly enough, as somebody pointed out in a thread that I was reading earlier today, with all eyes on Greenland and NATO suddenly concerned about Greenland and all the talks being about Greenland right now, what about Ukraine? And what is this opening the door for as Vladimir Putin continues to look at his options regarding his invasion of Ukraine?
Right, a lot of foreign policy issues to keep an eye on, but one big domestic issue we're still dealing with, healthcare. We're officially in the new year. It means the first month of higher insurance premiums for millions of Americans. We saw Trump roll out his new healthcare plan yesterday. The president has been repeatedly saying over the last few weeks that he wants to funnel money directly to Americans instead of paying money to insurance companies. But how does that solve the healthcare affordability issue? If the money Americans receive would still be spent on health insurance, or they would potentially face significantly higher prices if they try to go to the hospital, go to the doctor as an uninsured patient. How does this plan that the president and his administration are putting out now and that they'll be pushing on Capitol Hill, how does that help affordability?
Yeah, I think that's the big question. And like you mentioned, if the money that would be sent to Americans would be to pay for health insurance, well, that money would still end up in the insurance companies' pockets. I think there's a bigger concern that many Americans would just pocket the money because things are tight right now and not get insurance. I mean, the key here is that we have not seen specifics. We haven't seen legislative text. We haven't seen a timeline to this new plan. And people really are struggling with affordability, with affording not only healthcare costs, but utilities, their mortgage, their rent. And then the concern about the domino effects here. I mean, already we saw federal data shows 1.4 million fewer people on the ACA than this time last year. And so what's the ripple effect as people start dropping off? Well, rates are not only going to go up because of the subsidies expiring, but because to offset those costs. The concern that I hear so much in Montana, where I live, is about rural hospitals and their ideas. And we just heard Dr. Oz a short time ago talking about this $50 billion rural healthcare fund to kind of offset any cuts. But KFF has said that that's just 1/3 of the estimated loss. So there's a lot of concern about the domino effects of this if we can't figure this out. And the last thing I'll say is that any kind of proposals about sending individual checks, Congress holds the purse, right? And so that would require congressional approval. I don't think I have to tell you how great they are at agreeing on a very complicated issue like healthcare reimbursement.
Yeah, healthcare is certainly an issue that Congress has been trying to come up with a plan, but getting any kind of lasting changes to our healthcare system is likely going to require bipartisan compromise, something that can be hard to find on Capitol Hill these days. Maritza Giorgio, host of the podcast Grounded. As always, thank you for joining us and walking us through some of the biggest political stories of the week. And of course, you can find her podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for spending part of your evening with Today As It Happened. I'm Stephanie Liebergen, and have a wonderful Friday night and an excellent weekend.